The morning of Margaret Louise Kensington's funeral arrived with the kind of bitter clarity that only a Montana December could deliver. Snow had fallen through the night, blanketing the cemetery outside Billings in white, so pristine it hurt to look at directly. The sky stretched overhead like polished steel, cloudless and merciless, as if winter itself had decided to witness every moment of what came next. Robert Mitchell stood in the back row of the small stone church, shoulders square, despite the weight pressing down on them. At 58, he still carried himself like the combat engineer he'd been for 20 years. Spine straight, hands steady, jaw set against whatever the world decided to throw at him. His dark hair had gone mostly silver at the temples now, and the lines around his eyes told stories about bridges built in war zones and a left knee that never quite forgave Afghanistan. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to military funerals, the fabric slightly worn at the elbows, the tie knotted with precision because some habits never died. Beside him, Christopher Mitchell, Kit to everyone who mattered, gripped his father's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. 7 years old, small for his age, drowning in a suit jacket 2 sizes too big because there hadn't been time or money to buy one that fit. His brown hair stuck up in the back no matter how many times Rob tried to smooth it down, and his eyes, the same gray-blue as his father's, were red from crying he'd tried so hard to hide. At Kit's feet sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose silver-gray coat caught the winter light streaming through the church windows. The dog didn't fidget or whine. He simply sat ears forward, amber eyes scanning the room with the kind of alertness that came from years of military training. Ranger had saved Rob's life twice in Iraq. Now he seemed to understand his mission was different: keep the boy standing no matter what. The front pew held Margaret's blood family, and the distance between the two groups might as well have been measured in miles instead of feet. Patricia Kensington, Trish to her friends, though Rob had never been invited to use the name, occupied the center position. 36 years old, blonde hair pulled into a knot, so perfect it looked architectural, black Armani coat fitted to emphasize a figure maintained by expensive trainers and careful deprivation. Her face could have been carved from marble for all the emotion it showed, though her eyes, pale blue and calculating, never stopped moving. She leaned toward her brother Stephen, lips barely moving. The words carried anyway, meant to carry. "That boy doesn't belong here." Stephen Kensington sat rigid beside her, 32 and already looking older, the kind of exhaustion that came from swimming against currents too strong to fight. His dark suit hung loose on a frame that had lost weight recently, and his hands twisted together in his lap like they couldn't figure out where to settle. He didn't look at Trish when she spoke, didn't look at Rob or Kit either, just stared at the casket and said nothing at all. Donald Kensington commanded the far end of the pew the way he commanded every room he entered. 52, silver hair, precisely cut suit that cost more than Rob's truck, the bearing of a man accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. Margaret's younger brother, executor of her estate, the kind of businessman who measured success in zeros and power in leverage. His face showed appropriate grief, expertly calibrated. Rob had seen that expression before in officers who mourned fallen soldiers they'd never actually known. Not once did any of them turn around. Kit's hand trembled in Rob's grip. The boy's voice came out small and frightened, barely a whisper. "Dad, why is everyone staring?" Rob squeezed, gently, kept his voice steady, even though his throat wanted to close around the words. "They're not Buddy, just saying goodbye." But Kit was right. Eyes kept sliding toward them. Other mourners, distant relatives, Margaret's college friends who'd flown in from Seattle and Boston. The looks weren't hostile exactly, more puzzled, uncomfortable, like they couldn't quite place how Rob and Kit fit into the story being told here today. The pastor spoke about Margaret's generosity, her quiet strength, her devotion to family. Every word technically true, every word somehow managing to erase the last 2 years, the marriage that had given Rob a reason to believe in second chances the way Margaret had loved Kit, like he'd been born to her instead of to Sarah. The first wife Rob still dreamed about, sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn. Ranger shifted slightly, pressed closer to Kit's leg. The dog knew. Animals always knew. The service ended with a hymn Rob didn't know the words to. People filed out shaking hands with Trish and Donald, offering condolences that stopped dead before reaching the back row. Rob waited until the church emptied before moving Kit, still clinging to his hand, Ranger following 3 paces behind like a shadow with teeth. Outside, snow crunched under their feet. The parking lot stretched empty, and white tire tracks already filling in from fresh snow. Rob's truck, an ancient red Ford F-150 with rust blooming along the wheel. Wells sat alone at the far end, like even the vehicles understood the hierarchy here. Trish appeared at the church steps, pulling on leather gloves that probably cost more than Rob made in a month. Her voice carried across the parking lot, pitched to sound concerned while making sure everyone nearby could hear. "Robert will need the house keys by Friday. The realtor has showing scheduled." Rob stopped walking. Kit stopped too, looking up with confusion, starting to break through the grief. "Dad." Trish descended the steps carefully, heels finding purchase on salted stone. Up close, her perfume was sharp and expensive, cutting through the clean scent of snow. "Mother left the house to Stephen and me. I'm sure Kenneth explained that during the reading we scheduled for next week, but the property needs to be vacant for the listing. Friday, 3 days. Rob had lived in that house for 2 years, fixed its furnace when it died last winter, replaced the back deck Margaret had wanted, painted Kit's bedroom the pale blue color that made the boy feel safe. Now he had 72 hours to disappear." Stephen emerged from the church, stopped at the top of the steps when he saw the conversation happening. Something moved across his face. Guilt, maybe, or shame, but he didn't come closer, didn't intervene. Kit's voice cracked like ice breaking. "That's our house." Trish's eyes flicked down to the boy expression, cooling several more degrees. "It was your stepmother's house. Now it belongs to her children. That's how inheritance works, sweetheart." The word sweetheart dripped condescension like poison honey. Kit flinched like he'd been slapped. Rob put his hand on Kit's shoulder, felt the boy trembling under the too big jacket. When he spoke, his voice came out level and controlled, years of military discipline, keeping fury locked down where it couldn't escape. "We'll be out by Thursday." Trish smiled, thin and satisfied. "I knew you'd understand. Kenneth will have some papers for you to sign next week, just formalities." She started to turn away, then paused. "Oh, and Robert. Whatever Mother left you in the will, I'm sure it's adequate compensation for your companionship these past years." The words hung in the frozen air like an accusation. Companionship, not marriage, not love, just a transaction neatly concluded properly compensated. Rob didn't trust himself to respond. He guided Kit toward the truck, Ranger falling into step beside them. Behind them, Trish's heels clicked away across the parking lot, already moving on to whatever came next in her carefully ordered world. Kit climbed into the passenger seat, small body shaking with sobs he'd been holding back all morning. Rob shut the door, gently, walked around to the driver's side, leaned against the cold metal for just a moment while Ranger pressed against his leg. The dog looked up at him with those amber eyes that had seen too much, understood too much. Rob ran his hand over Ranger's head, felt the solid warmth, the absolute loyalty that never wavered or calculated or measured worth in dollars. "Come on, boy, let's go home." The word home stuck in his throat. "Let's go back to the house." They drove in silence through streets Rob had learned to navigate over the past 2 years. Kit cried quietly against the window, occasionally wiping his eyes with the sleeve of the too-big jacket. Ranger sat in the back seat perfectly still, watching both of them. The house appeared around a familiar corner, a 2-story colonial worth $2.8 million in Billings's best neighborhood, the kind of place Rob never imagined living. White siding, black shutters, perfect lawn, hidden under perfect snow. He'd replaced the gutters last spring, fixed the stone pathway in October. Margaret had sat on the porch swing every evening that summer, reading, while Kit played in the yard with Ranger chasing tennis balls that never quite came back clean. Now the porch swing hung empty chains, creaking slightly in the wind. Rob pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine. Neither of them moved to get out. Kit's voice came out small and lost. "Where are we going to go? Where?" "Somewhere." Rob reached over, ruffled the boy's perpetually messy hair. "We'll figure it out, buddy. We always do." "I don't want to figure it out. I want Mom." The words punched through Rob's chest like shrapnel. Sarah had been Mom first, Kit's birth mother, dead from eclampsia 7 years ago while bringing their son into the world. Then Margaret had become Mom too, filling a hole neither of them knew how to name. Now both were gone, and Kit had to start over again at 7 years old. Rob pulled his son close, let him cry against his shoulder, while snow began falling again, outside covering everything in white that would melt and freeze and make the world treacherous. 1 week later, Kenneth Warner's law office occupied 3 floors of downtown Billings's most prestigious building, all polished brass and dark wood that smelled like money and decisions made by people who'd never worried about rent. Rob sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly income back when he'd had monthly income, Kit beside him, Ranger at their feet, because Kenneth had taken one look at the service dog vest and decided not to argue. Across the conference table, Trish scrolled through her phone with the kind of attention that suggested the will reading ranked somewhere below checking email and above deciding what to have for lunch. Stephen stared at his hands. Donald occupied the head of the table, despite it not being his office, his law office, or his meeting, because Donald occupied whatever space he wanted and dared the world to object. Kenneth Warner looked older than 64 today. Silver hair, less perfectly combed than usual, slightly crooked glasses perched on his nose while he studied documents he'd probably read 100 times already. He'd known Margaret since college, played golf with her father, handled her divorce from Trish and Stephen's father 20 years ago. The sadness in his eyes looked genuine, but so did the nervousness. The last will and testament of Margaret Louise Kensington. Kenneth's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone delivering news, neither good nor bad, just legally binding. Dated March 15th of this year, properly witnessed and notarized. Trish looked up from her phone. Donald leaned forward slightly. Even Stephen stopped staring at his hands. The estate wasn't small. Kenneth worked through it methodically, the house at $2.8 million to Trish and Stephen, equally divided. Investment accounts totaling $2.1 million to Trish and Stephen, equally divided. A collection of antique furniture to Donald appraised value approximately $180,000. Various smaller bequests to charities. Margaret had supported the church. She'd attended a scholarship fund at her alma mater. Kit sat very still beside Rob, trying to understand numbers that didn't mean anything except that everything Margaret had owned was going to other people. Kenneth cleared his throat, turned a page. And to my husband, Robert James Mitchell, I leave the property located at Clearwater Ridge, Montana, a cabin and surrounding land, along with the contents of safe deposit box number 447 at First Montana Bank, Billings Branch. Silence filled the conference room like water filling a sinking ship. Trish's eyebrow lifted exactly 1 millimeter, the only reaction she permitted herself. A cabin. How generous. Donald leaned back in his expensive chair, smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Clearwater Ridge. That's up in the mountains, isn't it? Middle of nowhere. Old hunting area, mostly abandoned now. Kenneth slid a brown envelope across the polished table. Inside a single iron key, old-fashioned and heavy, the kind that opened serious locks. The property deed and additional documentation are in the safe deposit box. Mrs. Kensington was very specific about the sequence. Rob picked up the envelope, felt the weight of the key. Beside him, Kit leaned closer, curious despite everything. What's in the box? Dad? Don't know yet, buddy. Ranger, who'd been lying quietly at their feet, suddenly stood. The movement wasn't aggressive or alarmed, just purposeful. The German shepherd walked forward slowly, nose extended, toward the envelope in Rob's hand. Trish made a small sound of disgust. Really, Robert, control your animal. But Ranger wasn't being uncontrolled. He was being deliberate. The dog sniffed the envelope, once, twice, nostrils flaring. His ears came forward, a tail going level in that particular way that meant he'd found something, recognized something. Then his right front paw lifted and came down against the hardwood floor. One heavy impact, precise, intentional. Kenneth's face went pale. Just for a second, just enough for Rob to notice the lawyer's carefully neutral expression cracked into something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. Kit's small voice filled the silence. Ranger knows that smell. Donald's smile widened, sharp as a knife. The dog's having a moment. How touching. But Ranger wasn't having a moment. Military working dogs didn't have moments. They had training, purpose, and recognition that operated on levels humans couldn't access. Ranger had found something in that envelope, some scent marker that triggered memory. Rob held the dog's gaze, saw intelligence looking back, and something else. Certainty. Stephen spoke for the first time since entering the office, voice quiet and strained. Mom spent a lot of time at that cabin the last few years. She said it was peaceful. Trish shot him a look that could have stripped paint. Stephen subsided back into silence. Kenneth gathered his papers with hands that trembled just slightly. If there are no further questions, this concludes the reading. Mr. Mitchell, you can access the safe deposit box during regular banking hours. I'll provide the authorization paperwork. Rob stood, helped Kit to his feet, watched Ranger take up his position at the boy's side. The meeting was over, inheritance distributed, Margaret's final wishes delivered in neutral legal language that turned love and loss into asset allocation. Donald remained seated studying Rob with the kind of attention usually reserved for problems requiring solutions. "Robert, a word of advice. That cabin's been sitting empty for years. Probably needs significant repairs. If you'd like to discuss a sale once you've assessed the property, I'd be happy to connect you with developers who specialize in that area. Translations sell it to me cheap before you realize what it's worth." Rob met Donald's gaze without blinking. 20 years in the Army had taught him to recognize when he was being played. "I'll keep that in mind." Outside, December wind cut through downtown Billings like a promise of harder weather coming. Kit climbed into the truck's passenger seat, pulled his coat tighter. Ranger jumped into the back, settling with his usual precision. The safe deposit key sat heavy in Rob's pocket, and questions sat heavier in his mind. Why would Margaret leave him only a cabin when she'd had millions to distribute? Why the specific sequence cabin first, then safe deposit box? And why had Ranger reacted like he'd recognized something crucial in that envelope? Kit's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Do you think Margaret loved us?" The question shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. "She loved you more than her own kids, buddy. That's the truth." "Then why did she leave everything to them?" Rob didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Hell, he didn't have an answer that made sense to himself. They drove back to the house that wouldn't be theirs much longer. Stephen's car was already in the driveway, a sleek Tesla that hummed instead of rumbled, expensive and efficient, and absolutely Margaret's taste. He'd always liked Stephen better than Trish, probably, because Stephen seemed genuinely uncomfortable with how this was all playing out. The man himself stood on the porch, holding something. When Rob and Kit climbed out of the truck, Stephen descended the steps carefully, not quite meeting Rob's eyes. "I wanted to give this to Kit." He held out a photograph in a simple frame. "Before Trish packs everything up." The photo showed Margaret and Kit in the kitchen of this house, both covered in flour, both laughing. They'd been making cookies for Kit's 6th birthday, and Margaret had let him crack the eggs, even though he'd gotten shell in the batter. The joy on her face was absolutely real, the love unmistakable. Kit took the frame with trembling hands, stared at his second mother's smile. Stephen's voice came out rough. Margaret would want you to have this. She talked about that day for weeks." He finally looked at Rob. "I'm sorry for how they're treating you both." Rob studied Margaret's son, saw genuine regret there, and maybe shame. "You could speak up, tell Trish to back off." "I could." Stephen's jaw tightened. "But I won't be listened to. Never am." He started to walk away, stopped. "The cabin at Clearwater Ridge. Mom loved that place. She went there when she needed to think to get away from." He gestured vaguely at the house, the neighborhood, the life Margaret had built and apparently needed refuge from. "Take care of it." Then he was gone, driving away in his silent, expensive car, leaving Rob and Kit standing in the driveway of a house they had 2 more days to vacate. Kit clutched the photograph against his chest. "Can we bring this with us? We're bringing everything that matters, buddy," which turned out to be embarrassingly little. Rob had arrived at this marriage with 2 duffel bags of clothes, a toolbox, and memories he couldn't pack. Kit had a room full of toys and books, but most had been gifts from Margaret, and taking them felt like stealing from an estate that had already made clear they were owed nothing. Thursday morning, Rob loaded the truck with what remained of their life together, 2 duffel bags still. Kit's backpack with his favorite books and the photo Stephen had given him, Ranger's crate and food, and the worn blanket the dog slept on. Rob's toolbox because a man needed his tools, the wooden box containing his military medals, and Sarah's wedding ring, and Kit's hospital bracelet from the day he was born and his mother died. That was it. 2 years compressed into cargo that didn't even fill the truck bed. Kit made one last trip through his room, the pale blue walls Rob had painted, the window seat where he'd read while Margaret made dinner, the closet where he and Ranger used to hide during thunderstorms. When he came back down, his eyes were dry, but his face looked 10 years older. Rob locked the door for the last time, slid the keys through the mail slot like Trish had instructed. The metallic clink echoed in the empty foyer, final and absolute. They climbed into the truck. Ranger settled in the back seat with a soft sigh. Rob started. The engine pulled out of the driveway he'd shoveled snow from 100 times, turned onto streets that had briefly felt like home. Kit pressed his face against the window, watching the house disappear behind them. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the engine. "Where are we going?" Rob pulled the brown envelope from the glove compartment, felt the weight of the iron key. "North, to Clearwater Ridge." "What if there's nothing there?" "Then we'll build something." The words echoed what he'd said at the funeral, but they felt different now. Less like empty comfort and more like actual possibility. Margaret had left him a cabin for a reason. She'd been deliberate about everything else in her life. Why not this? They drove north through Montana in late December, leaving Billings behind as the city gave way to smaller towns, then to forest, then to wilderness that stretched unbroken under gray skies, heavy with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. The highway cut through mountains older than memory, past frozen rivers and stands of pine so thick they swallowed sound. Kit stayed quiet at first, grief and confusion too big for 7-year-old words. But after an hour he started asking questions, small ones, then bigger. "Dad, did you know Mom Margaret had a cabin?" Rob kept his eyes on the road, on ice patches hidden under innocent-looking asphalt. "Never mentioned it. Not once in 2 years. Why would she keep it secret?" "Don't know, buddy." Kit processed this, small forehead wrinkling the way it did when he was working through complicated ideas. "Trish said the cabin's not worth anything, and Mr. Donald said it's in the middle of nowhere." He looked up at his father with those 2 old eyes. "So why did Mom Margaret give it to us?" That was the question, wasn't it? Rob had been turning it over in his mind since the will reading, examining it from every angle like a suspicious package that might explode if handled wrong. Margaret had been methodical, careful, the kind of woman who planned grocery lists 3 days in advance. She wouldn't leave her husband a worthless cabin in the middle of nowhere without purpose. "I think," Rob said slowly, "your mom had reasons we haven't figured out yet." Kit accepted this with the resilience children had when the adults in their lives had already failed them too many times to count. He pulled out one of his books, tried to read, but kept looking out the window instead, at landscape growing wilder with every passing mile. In the back seat, Ranger shifted position. Rob glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the dog sitting upright now, instead of lying down ears forward, attention fixed on something outside the window. "What is it, boy?" Ranger's tail didn't wag. His entire body had gone still in that particular way that meant recognition, anticipation, mission, focus. The dog was staring northwest through the window, not randomly scanning, but tracking something specific. Kit noticed too. Ranger's acting weird. Not weird, focused. On what? Something he remembers. The highway sign appeared around the next curve, Clearwater Ridge, 15 miles. Ranger's ears came even more forward. A low sound escaped his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Communication. Kit leaned between the seats to look at the dog. "Have you been here before?" Ranger turned his head, met the boy's eyes, then looked back out the window. The message was clear. "Yes, and I know exactly where we're going." Rob's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Margaret must have brought the dog here multiple times based on Ranger's certainty. But when she'd never mentioned weekend trips, never disappeared for days at a time, how had she hidden entire journeys to a cabin 6 hours from Billings? The road began to descend, switching back on itself as it dropped into a valley carved by time and water. Through breaks in the pine forest, Rob caught glimpses of a river below the Clearwater, presumably running fast and dark between snow-covered banks. Then the valley opened up and the town appeared, not abandoned, not even close. Clearwater Ridge spread along both sides of the river like something out of a postcard about simpler times. Wooden storefronts painted in faded reds and blues, a white church with a stone steeple, children playing in snow-covered yards, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into air so cold it made the smoke hang instead of disperse. Maybe 800 people, Rob guessed, small enough that everyone knew everyone, big enough to sustain itself. Kit pressed closer to the window. "Dad, look. It's like a movie." It did have that quality, too perfect, too preserved, like someone had frozen a slice of Montana from 70 years ago and kept it running just to prove such places could still exist. But people moved on the sidewalks, bundled against December cold. Lights glowed warm in windows. This wasn't a ghost town. This was life continuing. Near what looked like the town's only gas station, an older man stood outside a hardware store sweeping snow from the entrance. Tall even with age's slight stoop, white beard catching afternoon light, carpenter's hands gripping the broom like an old friend. He wore a heavy canvas coat, dusted with sawdust, that no amount of brushing ever quite removed. The man looked up as Rob's truck rolled past, stopped sweeping, stared. Then he raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Not friendly stranger wave, knowing wave, recognition wave. Rob's foot eased off the gas confusion, making him hesitate. He'd never been to Clearwater Ridge in his life. Never met that man, but the wave otherwise suggested history, where none should exist. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain. "Affirmative." Kit twisted to look back as they passed. "Did you see that he waved like he knows us?" "I saw." "But we don't know him." Right. Except apparently they did, or at least someone did. The pieces weren't fitting together, and Rob felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that used to mean IEDs buried in Afghan roads. Something wrong, something hidden, something about to change the situation completely. The GPS on his phone chimed. Destination ahead. Rob followed the directions onto a dirt road that curved away from town. Following the river upstream, the forest closed in again, pine and aspen standing silent guard. Snow lay thicker here, untouched, except for animal tracks. Deer, rabbit, something larger that might have been elk. The cabin appeared around a bend like a secret the forest had been keeping. Not riverside. Set back about 50 yards, built from gray fieldstone that had weathered to the color of winter sky. Cedar roof pitched steep to shed heavy snow. 2 windows flanking a solid wooden door. Behind it, half hidden by trees, a longer building in the same weathered cedar workshop, or barn, or boathouse, hard to tell from here. Rob turned off the engine, Silence flooded in, broken only by wind through pine branches and the distant rush of Clearwater River over stones. Kit's voice came out awed and uncertain. "This is ours, apparently." It looked solid, well maintained even. Not the ruin Donald had implied, not the worthless shack Trish had suggested. Someone had taken care of this place, kept the roof intact, the stonework sound. The porch showed no sag, the windows no cracks. Ranger jumped out before Rob could open the door, hit the ground running, not exploring randomly the way dogs did in new places, but moving with purpose toward the longer building behind the cabin. Kit scrambled after him. "Ranger, wait!" Rob followed, boots crunching through snow, already reaching for the iron key in his pocket, even though he knew it probably wouldn't fit. This lock wouldn't be that simple. Ranger reached the workshop and stopped at the door, looked back at Rob with amber eyes that held something almost like impatience. "Hurry up! We're wasting time!" The workshop door wasn't locked. It swung open with a protest of hinges that needed oil, revealing interior shadows and the smell of old wood and cold iron and something else. Dust. Lots of dust. Rob found a light switch, flipped it. Nothing. Power wasn't connected, or the bulbs had burned out decades ago. He pulled out his phone, used the flashlight to illuminate what Margaret had left behind. A boat builder's workshop. That's what it was, or had been. Wooden boat frames rested on sawhorses, hulls half-finished in that particular curve that suggested grace on water. Racks of tools lined the walls, chisels, planes, clamps, all organized with the precision of someone who knew their craft. A workbench ran the length of the back wall, scarred with years of use but solid underneath. Dust coated everything, not the thin layer from a few weeks, but the thick accumulation of abandonment. Nobody had worked here in months, maybe longer. Ranger moved through the space like he was retracing old steps, sniffing corners, checking behind tool racks. Searching. Kit stayed close to Rob, small hand finding his father's larger one. "Dad, what is this place? Looks like someone built boats here, a long time ago. Did Mom Margaret build boats?" "No idea, buddy. But she'd owned this workshop, this cabin, this land. Had kept it secret from her family, from her husband, from everyone, except apparently a German shepherd who remembered the layout better than any dog should." Ranger stopped at the back wall near the workbench, started pawing at the floor claws, scraping wood. Rob walked over, knelt down. The floorboards looked ordinary enough, but when he pressed down on the one Ranger was indicating, it shifted slightly. Loose. Kit crouched beside him, breathing fast with sudden excitement. "There's something under there." Rob pried up the board carefully. Underneath a shallow cavity had been carved into the support beam, and inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, sat a small wooden box. His hand shook slightly as he lifted it out. The box was simple cedar, no lock, just a fitted lid that pulled free with gentle pressure. Inside, a military compass and a folded piece of paper. Rob picked up the compass first. Not standard issue. Customized, old, brass gone dark with age and handling. He turned it over, and there, engraved on the back in Margaret's precise handwriting, coordinates north 47 degrees, 12 minutes, 45 seconds, west 114 degrees, 38 minutes, 22 seconds. Kit leaned in close. "What do those numbers mean?" "GPS coordinates." Rob pulled out his phone, typed them in, waited while the signal searched for satellites. When the location loaded, his breath caught. The coordinates pointed to downtown Clearwater Ridge, specifically to the town hall. The folded paper crackled slightly as Rob opened it. Margaret's handwriting again, the loops and precise crosses unmistakable. Rob, if you're reading this, Kenneth Warner lied. The key isn't for this cabin. It's for the safe deposit box, but you'll need the compass first. Trust Ranger. He knows the way. M. Rob read it twice, hands clenching hard enough to crease the paper. Kenneth had lied. Or not lied exactly, but misdirected. Given Rob a key and let him assume it was for the cabin when it was actually for something else entirely. Why? On whose orders? Margaret's to protect something or someone else's to hide it? Kit's small voice trembled. Dad, what does it say? Rob looked at his son, then at Ranger, who watched him with patient certainty, waiting for the human to catch up with what the dog already understood. It says your mom was smarter than all of them combined. Headlights swept across the workshop windows, a car approaching up the dirt road. Rob tensed hand moving instinctively to his belt, where a sidearm would have rested 20 years ago, but didn't now. Old habits. Ranger moved to the door, not aggressive, but alert. Waiting. The car stopped outside the cabin. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps crunched through snow, accompanied by a voice calling out cheerfully. Hello, Mr. Mitchell? Are you there? Female voice, older Montana accent that spoke of generations raised in these mountains. Rob stepped out of the workshop, Kit and Ranger flanking him. An old station wagon sat in the clearing, green paint, faded exhaust, making white clouds in the cold air. The woman approaching looked close to 70, silver hair pulled into a loose braid. Round face, creased with laugh lines that had earned their place through decades of use. She wore a blue apron over her heavy coat, dusted with flour, that suggested she'd come straight from work, and carried a wicker basket covered with a red cloth. She stopped a respectful distance away, smile warm, but eyes assessing Rob with the quick judgment of someone who'd sized up strangers for a living. You must be Robert Mitchell. I'm Carol Brennan. Run the bakery on Main Street. She gestured toward town with the basket. Figured you might be hungry after a long drive. The smell hit him, fresh bread, still warm, and something else. Stew, maybe. His stomach clenched with sudden hunger. He'd been ignoring since breakfast in Billings this morning, which felt like a lifetime ago now. Kit's eyes went wide, locked on the basket with the desperate focus of a 7-year-old who'd forgotten to eat lunch. Thank you, ma'am. Carol's smile softened. And who's this young man? Christopher Mitchell. Kit. Well, Kit, there's apple pie in here too, if your dad says it's okay. Kit looked up at Rob with pleading eyes. Rob managed something that might have passed for a smile. After the stew, Carol handed over the basket, heavier than it looked, packed with enough food for 3 meals at least. Then her gaze shifted to Ranger, and something changed in her expression. Not fear. Recognition. Well now. She took a step closer, studied the dog with the kind of attention usually reserved for old friends appearing unexpectedly. He's been here before, hasn't he? Rob felt the pieces shifting again, questions multiplying faster than answers. You've seen him. Carol shook her head. Not exactly, but Margaret talked about her dog. Big German shepherd, smart as 3 regular dogs put together. Said he'd been to war and back just like someone else she loved. Her eyes moved to Rob, kind but knowing. That would be you, I expect. The world tilted slightly. You knew Margaret. Knew her honey she and I baked together every summer for 15 years. Best friend I had. Carol's voice carried genuine grief, recent enough to still hurt. Except she called herself Louise, not Margaret. Said she came up here to get away from city life, be just plain folks for a while. Kit's hand found Rob's again, squeezing tight. The boy's voice came out confused and a little frightened. "But Dad lived with Mom Margaret. She didn't come here every summer." Carol's expression shifted to something that might have been pity or understanding or both. She looked at Rob with eyes that had seen enough of life to know when someone was drowning in questions they couldn't answer. "Maybe we should talk inside. It's too cold for standing around, and that stew won't stay hot forever." Rob nodded, unable to find words. They walked to the cabin together, and when he slid the iron key into the lock, it turned smoothly, too smoothly. Someone had maintained this lock, oiled it, kept it functional. The door opened on a space that smelled like cedar and cold stone and absence. One room, basically with a sleeping area, partitioned by a half wall. Stone fireplace along one side, wood already stacked beside it. Simple kitchen with a propane stove, table and chairs, leather couch worn soft with use. Everything clean, everything ready, like someone had just stepped out and would be back any moment, like someone had known they were coming. Carol set the basket on the kitchen table, moved around the space with the ease of someone who'd been here before. She found mugs in a cupboard, plates stacked neatly in another, pulled them out, like this was her kitchen too. Propane's connected. Margaret made sure of that. Water heater works off the same tank. Rob watched her light the stove with practiced efficiency, wondering how many times she'd done exactly this. How often did Margaret come here? Carol poured stew into bowls, the smell making Kit gravitate toward the table like iron to a magnet. Every summer, 2, sometimes 3 weeks, started before you married her, kept coming after. She paused, ladle halfway to the third bowl. "You really didn't know?" The question landed like an accusation, even though Carol's voice stayed gentle. Rob had spent 2 years as Margaret's husband, lived in her house, slept in her bed, and apparently knew nothing about the woman she became when she drove 6 hours north and transformed into someone named Louise, who baked with strangers and maintained a cabin he'd never heard mentioned. Kit climbed onto a chair, accepted the bowl Carol slid toward him. "Mom, Margaret kept lots of secrets." Carol's eyes went soft, watching the boy try to manage his spoon with hands still clumsy from cold. "She kept them to protect what mattered. Your daddy and you mattered most of all." Rob forced himself to eat, though the stew tasted like bush, despite being perfectly seasoned. Ranger settled near the fireplace, head on his paws, but eyes tracking every movement in the room. The dog knew something had known it since the will reading, maybe longer. Rob needed to figure out what. After they'd eaten, after Kit had demolished a slice of apple pie that left crumbs across his entire face, Carol pulled on her coat to leave. She stopped at the door, hand on the knob, hesitation finally showing through her steady composure. "There's something else you should know. George Hartwell, the man who waved at you when you drove through town, he used to maintain this place. Margaret paid him every winter to check the roof, clear snow, keep things functional." Carol's weathered hands twisted together. "Payment stopped 6 months ago. George figured something was wrong, but Margaret never said what. 6 months ago. Right when Margaret's heart condition started accelerating, when she'd started spending more time in doctor's offices than anywhere else, when the family pressure from Donald about investments and property sales had intensified until her blood pressure required medication strong enough to make her dizzy." Rob's jaw clenched. "Did she seem scared when you last saw her?" Carol considered this, head tilting slightly. "Not scared, determined, like she'd made decisions and needed to see them through." She opened the door, cold air rushing in. "Town hall opens at 8 tomorrow. Might be worth a visit." Then she was gone, station wagon crunching back down the dirt road, leaving Rob and Kit alone in a cabin that belonged to a woman neither of them had fully known. Kit yawned hard enough, his jaw cracked. The long drive, the emotional weight, the pie, sitting heavy in his stomach, exhaustion hit the boy all at once. Rob guided him to the sleeping area, helped him into pajamas, tucked him under quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Kit's eyes drooped halfway closed, then struggled open again. "Dad, are we staying here?" Rob smoothed down the perpetually messy hair. "For now, buddy. Get some sleep. But what about Trish and Mr. Donald? Won't they come take this too?" The fear in that small voice cut deeper than any knife. Kit had already lost 2 mothers and a home. Now he expected to lose this refuge before they'd even spent one night in it. Rob sat on the edge of the narrow bed, kept his voice steady, even though rage churned in his gut. "Nobody's taking anything from us again. I promise." Kit's hand found his held tight. "You promise, 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 promise." The boy drifted off within minutes, face finally relaxing into something approaching peace. Ranger moved from his spot by the fireplace to curl up beside the bed, assuming guard position without being asked. The dog knew his mission. Rob built a fire, fed it until flames pushed back the December cold, then pulled out the military compass and Margaret's note. The coordinates pointed to Town Hall. Carol had basically confirmed it, but what was he supposed to find there? He typed the coordinates into his phone again, this time switching to satellite view. The image showed a brick building in downtown Clearwater Ridge, 3 stories probably built in the 1920s based on the architecture, municipal offices according to the label, storage in the basement likely. Archives. Margaret had hidden something there, something she couldn't risk keeping at the cabin or the Billings house, something important enough to require a compass with engraved coordinates and a scent trail for a military working dog to follow. Rob pulled out the iron key Kenneth had given him, turned it over in the firelight. Not a cabin key, Carol had opened the door without it. Not a workshop key, that door hadn't been locked. So what did it open? Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind through pine, every sound pulled Rob halfway to alertness before he forced himself back down. Old combat instincts never quite shut off. By the time winter dawn turned the windows gray, he'd managed maybe 4 hours of fractured rest. Kit woke hungry and disoriented, took a minute to remember where they were and why. Rob made oatmeal on the propane stove, watched the boy eat mechanically while staring at nothing. Processing. 7-year-olds weren't supposed to have this much to process. They walked to town at 8:15, snow crunching under Boots' breath, making white clouds. Ranger ranged ahead, stopping occasionally to check that his humans followed, then pressing forward with purpose. The dog knew this route, had walked it before. Clearwater Ridge looked different in morning light, less like a postcard, more like a real place where real people lived real lives. The bakery Carol owned showed lights on behind steamed windows, the smell of fresh bread drifting into the street. The hardware store where George Hartwell had been sweeping yesterday stood open tools displayed in the window. The church steeple rose white against pine-covered mountains, and somewhere a school bell rang, calling children to lessons. Town Hall occupied a corner lot, brick, darkened by decades of weatherstone steps worn smooth by generations of boots. Rob pushed through the heavy door into warmth that smelled like old paper and floor wax and coffee burning too long on a burner. A woman at the front desk looked up, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, cardigan buttoned over a floral print dress. Her nameplate read Deputy Clerk, but her expression suggested she ran this place regardless of what her title claimed. Rob approached Kit, close beside him, Ranger waiting just outside, because government buildings got touchy about dogs that weren't specifically service animals. "Morning, I'm looking for the archives." The woman's eyes traveled from Rob's weathered face to Kit's uncertain expression, lingered on the military bearing Rob couldn't hide, even in civilian clothes. "Archives are in the basement. Need something specific or just browsing history?" "Specific. Storage unit number 7, Margaret Kensington's unit." Something shifted in the woman's face. "You're Robert Mitchell." Not a question, a statement, like she'd been expecting him. Rob's hand moved instinctively toward Kit's shoulder, protective. "How did you—" "Carol called this morning. Said you'd probably be coming by." The woman stood, pulled a key ring from her desk drawer. "I'm Amanda Fletcher, town clerk. Carol's my sister." She gestured toward a door marked "Basement Access." "Follow me." The stairs descended into cooler air, fluorescent lights, buzzing overhead walls, lined with filing cabinets and boxes labeled by year. At the far end, a row of wire mesh storage units stood like small cages numbered 1 through 12. Amanda stopped at Unit 7, selected a key, then paused. "Margaret paid rent on this unit for 18 years. Never missed a payment. Last one came 6 months ago with a note saying if a man named Robert Mitchell showed up asking, I should let him in, no questions asked." She turned the key in the padlock. "So here we are. No questions." The lock clicked open. Amanda pulled it free, swung the wire door wide. "Take your time. I'll be upstairs if you need anything." Then she was gone, footsteps echoing back up the stairs, leaving Rob and Kit alone with whatever Margaret had hidden in this 8x8 wire cage. The storage unit held 3 items: a leather portfolio, a medium-sized cardboard box sealed with packing tape, and a banker's box labeled in Margaret's handwriting for Rob, the truth. Rob's hand shook as he lifted the banker's box lid. Inside, organized with Margaret's characteristic precision, lay documents that made the world tilt sideways. A will, different from the one Kenneth had read. This one, dated 2 months before Margaret's death, notarized by a lawyer in Helena, not Kenneth, someone independent. Rob scanned the first page, then the second, then had to sit down hard on the concrete floor because his knees stopped working. Kit crouched beside him. "Dad, what's wrong?" Rob couldn't answer, couldn't form words around what he was reading. The real will, because that's what this was clearly labeled. Last will and testament, witnessed and notarized, and absolutely legal distributed Margaret's estate completely differently from what Kenneth had presented. Total estate value, $12.4 million. To Patricia Kensington, the Billings house valued at $2.8 million, and investment accounts totaling $900,000, total $3.7 million. To Stephen Kensington, investment accounts totaling $900,000, and the antique furniture collection, total $1.1 million. To Donald Kensington, nothing. Specifically, explicitly nothing. To Robert James Mitchell, everything else. The cabin at Clearwater Ridge and 2,400 acres of surrounding land, mineral rights, water rights, timber rights, estimated total value $8.2 million, plus remaining investment accounts of $600,000 for operating expenses and property maintenance. Total to Rob $8.8 million. But there was a condition. Rob had to live on the Clearwater property for a minimum of 3 consecutive years to inherit. If he left before 3 years passed, everything reverted to something called the Clearwater Heritage Foundation, which would be established upon his departure. Kit's small voice penetrated the roaring in Rob's ears. "Dad, you're crying!" Rob touched his face, found wetness there. Not grief, shock. Margaret had given him everything, not just survival money or consolation prize, but everything that mattered: the land, the resources, the future. And she'd structured it so he couldn't be forced out, couldn't be pressured to sell, couldn't be manipulated by Donald's lawyers or Trish's contempt. 3 years. Just live here for 3 years, and it all became uncontestably his. Kit leaned against his shoulder. Is it good crying or bad crying? Rob pulled the boy close, held him tight enough to feel the small heartbeat against his chest. Good crying, buddy. Really good crying. The leather portfolio contained property deeds, survey maps, title, insurance documents. The land Margaret owned stretched along both sides of Clearwater River for nearly 3 miles, encompassing the cabin, the workshop, old-growth forest, riverfront access, and what looked like ruins of an old marina at the northern boundary. The cardboard box held something else entirely: a journal. Margaret's journal, leather-bound pages filled with her precise handwriting. Rob opened to the first page. If you're reading this, Rob, you've passed the first test. You found the compass-trusted ranger and came to town hall instead of giving up. Good. You'll need that persistence for what comes next. He flipped forward, found entries dated over the past 2 years. March 10th. Rob fixed the kitchen sink today without being asked. Noticed it was dripping, grabbed his tools, solved the problem. He never makes a show of it. Donald called while Rob was working, asked again about selling the Clearwater property. Said I was wasting assets that could generate income. Told him no, like always. His voice got that edge it gets when he's planning something. June 3rd. Took Ranger to Clearwater for training session number 7. The dog is brilliant. He can find the compass now just by scent, leads straight to town hall from anywhere in town. Rob would be proud if he knew, but he can't know. Not yet. Not until it's safe. September 15th. Victoria made another comment about Kit today. Said he's not real family within his hearing. That boy is more mine than she'll ever be. He calls me Mom, like he means it, like Sarah would want him to. After Victoria left, Kit asked if I wished I'd had a son instead of a daughter. Told him I have a son, and his name is Christopher. He cried. I cried. Rob found us both crying in the kitchen and thought something terrible had happened. Something terrible had happened. We'd both realized how much we love each other. November 2nd. Blood pressure through the ceiling again. Dr. Matthews increased medication, said stress is the main factor. Donald called 3 times today about some development deal he wants me to invest in. When I refused, he said he'd handle it through other channels. I know what that means. He'll try to contest the will claim, undue influence, attack Rob's character. I've prepared for this. Kenneth has the fake will carefully constructed to make Donald think he lost, but Rob won nothing important. The real will is in Clearwater safe waiting. 3 years should be enough time for Rob to establish himself, prove his intent, make challenging the will impossible. Rob stopped reading, throat too tight to breathe properly. Margaret had been playing chess while everyone else played checkers. She'd known Donald would fight, known Kenneth could be pressured, known the family would close ranks against the outsider who'd married into money. So she'd set a trap, given them a fake will that satisfied just enough to prevent immediate legal action while hiding the real inheritance where they'd never think to look until it was too late. Kit tugged on his sleeve. "What does it say?" Rob looked at his son, at the boy Margaret had loved enough to outmaneuver her entire family. "It says we're home, really home. Nobody can take it away." Understanding dawned slowly across Kit's face, followed by something that might have been the first real hope Rob had seen there since the funeral. "Promise? Your mom?" Margaret made sure of it. They spent another hour in the basement, Rob reading through the journal, while Kit explored the storage unit's corners. More entries detailed Margaret's deteriorating health, Donald's increasing pressure, Trish's casual cruelty, but also moments of joy. Kit's birthday parties, quiet dinners with Rob, summers at Clearwater, baking with Carol. The final entry, dated 2 weeks before her death, hit hardest. "Rob, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've found your way through the maze I built. I'm sorry for the secrets. I'm sorry for the lies of omission. But I'm not sorry for protecting you and Kit. Donald will try to destroy you. It's what he does. He'll dig into your past, find the Kandahar investigation threatened to make it public. He'll hire lawyers, pressure Kenneth, maybe even forge documents. Don't let him win. The 3-year condition isn't punishment, it's armor. If you live on the land, improve it, serve the community. Donald can't claim you married me for money. The timeline proves otherwise. The community testimony proves otherwise. You become untouchable. Build something at Clearwater, my love. Build something that matters. You're a combat engineer. You spent 20 years building bridges in impossible places. Now build one more between Kit and the future he deserves. P.S. Ranger knows more than you think. Trust the dog." Rob closed the journal, swiped at his eyes again. Kit pretended not to notice, busy examining a map of the property that showed every tree stand, every creek, every potential building site. They carried everything upstairs. Thanked Amanda, Fletcher walked back toward the cabin through town that suddenly felt less foreign. People nodded as they passed. Carol waved from the bakery window. A woman sweeping the post office steps smiled at Kit. George Hartwell stood outside his hardware store again, this time without the broom. Tall, despite 72 years' white beard catching morning sun, Carpenter's hands hanging loose at his sides. When he saw them coming, he stepped forward. "Thought you'd made it." His voice carried the rough warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime shouting over powered tools and river rapids. "I'm George Hartwell. Used to maintain Margaret's place before." He trailed off, awkward. Rob extended his hand. George shook it firmly, grip still strong, calluses meeting calluses in the universal recognition of men who worked with their hands. "Figured you'd need help getting things running again. Workshop's been sitting idle too long." George's blue eyes studied Rob with the quick assessment of someone who'd hired and fired enough people to recognize quality. "You know anything about boats?" Rob shook his head. "Army engineer. Bridges, mostly." "Bridges?" George smiled slightly. "Well, boats are just bridges that float. Come by tomorrow morning. Bring the boy. Got someone he should meet." Before Rob could respond, a girl burst from the hardware store's entrance, 8 years old, dark braids, flying winter coat, unbuttoned despite the cold. She skidded to a stop when she saw Kit, sudden shyness replacing the energy. George's rough voice went soft. "This is Rachel, my granddaughter, lives with me since." Another awkward pause. "Well, she lives with me." Rachel studied Kit with the solemn evaluation children used when deciding if another kid qualified as friend or threat. "You're the new boy." Kit nodded, equally solemn. "I'm Kit." "Want to see the beaver dam?" Rachel pointed toward the river. "It's huge. Biggest one in the valley. Kit looked up at Rob with hope and uncertainty mixed together. Making friends had been hard back in Billings, where the other kids knew he was different, knew his mom had died and his stepmom had money, and something about the whole situation felt wrong to their 7-year-old instincts. Rob nodded. "Stay where Mr. Hartwell can see you." The kids ran off toward the river, Ranger trailing behind in protective mode. George watched them go, something easing in his weathered face. Rachel needed a friend. Lost her parents 2 years back. Car accident. George's voice stayed steady, but pain leaked through anyway. She and Kit got something in common, I expect. Rob understood. Both kids knew what losing mothers felt like. Both carried grief heavier than their small shoulders should bear. They stood in companionable silence, watching children disappear between pine trees, Ranger's silver form visible as he shadowed them. Finally, George spoke again. "Margaret talked about you, said you were the first man she'd met who didn't measure worth in dollars." George pulled work gloves from his pocket, studied them like they held answers. "Also said her family would come after you, try to take what she left. That happening?" Rob thought about Donald and Trish, about the will, reading about expectations and contempt. They came once already, at the funeral, might come again. "When they do," George said slowly, "town'll be watching. Margaret did a lot of good here. Quiet good, the kind that matters. People remember." The old man walked back into his store, leaving Rob standing in winter sunlight, wondering how many people in Clearwater Ridge knew Margaret's secrets, while her own family and her husband had remained completely blind. That afternoon, another visitor arrived at the cabin. Tall man in his late 50s, long brown ranger coat, tied-back gray hair, face carved by weather and years of listening to other people's pain. He knocked politely, waited until Rob opened the door. "Robert Mitchell, I'm Timothy Bradford, pastor at the Lake Church." He gestured vaguely toward the white steeple visible through trees. "Thought you might want this." He held out an envelope slightly yellowed, sealed with wax that bore Margaret's initial pressed into red. Rob's hand trembled taking it. "When did she—" "4 months ago. Came to my office, said if a man named Robert Mitchell and a boy named Kit ever showed up in Clearwater, I should give you this." Timothy's dark eyes held genuine compassion. "She also said you'd probably need a friend. I'm offering—" The envelope stayed sealed while Timothy explained about the church roof Margaret had paid to fix 7 years ago, the playground equipment she'd donated anonymously, the winter clothes fund that somehow always had money when families needed help. Always anonymous, always quiet, always Margaret. After the pastor left, promising to return with his wife bearing a casserole, because apparently that's what pastors' wives did, Rob opened the envelope with fingers that barely cooperated. Margaret's handwriting, again, always speaking from beyond death, guiding him through mazes she'd built. "Rob, if you're reading this, Scout did his job. I called him Scout instead of Ranger in Clearwater. Fewer questions that way. That dog is smarter than both of us combined. I know my family. Donald wants money. Trish wants status. Stephen just wants peace, but won't fight for it. They would destroy Clearwater to get what they think they deserve. But you never wanted anything from me except to fix the kitchen sink and make me laugh. Clearwater was my refuge before I found you. Now it's yours. Build something that matters here. Teach Kit what community means. You were a combat engineer. You built bridges in war zones. Now build them in peacetime. P.S. Kit is as much my son as if I'd given birth to him. Don't let anyone tell him different, especially not my daughter." Rob sat on the cabin's porch step ladder, clenched in his fist, and let himself cry properly for the first time since Margaret died. Not quiet tears, not controlled grief, full-body sobs that came from the center of his chest and refused to stop. Kit found him like that when he came back from the river with Rachel and Ranger, all three of them flushed with cold and happiness that evaporated the moment they saw Rob's face. Kit ran to him, small arms wrapping around his father's neck. "Dad, what's wrong?" Rob held his son close, breathing in the scent of pine and river water and little boy sweat. "Nothing's wrong, buddy. Mom, Margaret left us a letter. She loved you so much." "I loved her, too." Kit's voice broke. "I miss her." "Me too." Rachel stood at a respectful distance, uncertain whether to stay or go. Ranger made the decision for her, moving to press against her side in the same comforting gesture he used with Kit. The dog knew grief when he saw it knew all three of these humans needed each other. They sat together on the porch until the sun dropped toward the mountains and Kit's stomach rumbled loud enough to break the moment. Rachel's grandfather appeared at the end of the dirt road, walking up to collect his granddaughter, accepting Rob's thanks with a simple nod that said this was what neighbors did. That night, Rob made dinner from Carol's leftovers while Kit sat at the table drawing pictures of the beaver dam with crayons Rachel had given him. Normal, almost, like they might actually build a life here instead of just surviving. The black Escalade arrived 3 days later. Rob was in the workshop with George learning the basics of boat hull construction when Ranger's warning bark cut through the sound of hand planes shaping cedar. Not the playful bark, the alert bark, threat incoming. Kit was at the cabin with Rachel, both kids working on homework. George had deemed acceptable babysitting while the adults worked. Rob's protective instincts went on full alert. George saw his face change. "What is it, company? The kind that doesn't get invited?" They emerged from the workshop to see Donald's Escalade pulling into the clearing, pristine black paint, looking obscene against snow and pine. 3 doors opened simultaneously. Donald, first expensive overcoat and leather gloves, moving with the confidence of someone who'd bought his way through every obstacle life presented. Trish, next equally expensive, equally confident. Stephen last hanging back slightly, like he wanted plausible deniability for whatever came next. Rob moved to intercept them before they reached the cabin, before they got near Kit. George flanked him, silent support. Donald's smile could have cut glass. "Robert, quite the estate you've discovered here." Rob planted himself between his family and the cabin door. "What do you want? Just to talk." Donald's eyes traveled across the property, calculating, assessing. "We've done some research on land values in this area. Turns out your little cabin sits on property worth considerably more than anyone realized." Trish pulled out her phone, swiped to a document. "Current market value for riverfront property, this size, approximately $800,000. We're prepared to purchase it from you. Cash. Immediate closing." Rob's jaw clenched hard enough his teeth ached. "Not for sale." "You haven't heard our offer." Donald's smile widened. $1 million for land you acquired for free. That's enough to buy a nice house somewhere, set up Kit's college fund live comfortably. George shifted slightly closer to Rob, wordless solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. Rob's voice came out flat and final. "I said no." Trish's eyes narrowed. "You're being foolish. This is more money than you've seen in your life." "Then I guess I'll have to learn to handle it." Answers still no. Donald's expression hardened, charm falling away like a mask. "Then we'll make this difficult." Rob's military training kicked in, assess threat, identify leverage, prepare defensive positions. How difficult. I've hired investigators. Donald stepped closer, voice dropping to conversational threat level. Your military discharge, the incident in Kandahar, the investigation that almost ended your career. How would it look if that became public? The town's new resident with a questionable military record. Rob felt the ground shift under his feet. Kandahar, 15 years ago. The bridge collapse that killed 2 civilians and nearly killed Rob's entire career. 6 months of investigation before they'd cleared him, proven the contractor had used substandard materials, established that Rob had followed every regulation perfectly. But investigations left scars in permanent records, questions that never fully disappeared. Enough ammunition for someone like Donald to weaponize if he wanted. Kit appeared at the cabin door, Rachel beside him, both children sensing tension. Dad. Donald glanced at the boy, then back at Rob. Rob. 3 days, Mitchell. Accept our offer, or I release everything to the press. Local news national, if I can manage it. Disgraced veteran inherits fortune. Has a nice ring to it. They left then, Escalade's engine barely audible as it glided back down the dirt road, leaving silence that felt like aftermath. George spoke first, voice rough with anger. That man's poison. Rob couldn't argue. Kit ran to him, wrapped small arms around his waist. Rachel stood uncertain until George gestured her over, pulled her close. What are you going to do? George's question held no doubt Rob would do something, just curiosity about what. Rob looked at the cabin Margaret had left him, the workshop where George was teaching him to build boats, the river where Kit had started laughing again. 3 days to decide between financial security and everything that mattered. Except it wasn't really a decision at all. I'm going to fight. Kenneth Warner arrived the next morning in a sedan that had seen better decades, pulling up to the cabin just as Rob was splitting firewood behind the workshop. The lawyer climbed out slowly, briefcase in hand, looking 10 years older than he had at the will reading. Guilt aged people faster than time. Rob buried the axe in the chopping block, didn't offer a handshake. Come to deliver more lies. Kenneth flinched, but didn't retreat. I came to help, if you'll let me. Kit and Rachel watched from the cabin porch, Ranger between them in protective stance. George emerged from the workshop, wiping wood shavings from his hands, positioning himself within earshot, but giving the conversation space. Kenneth opened his briefcase with shaking fingers, pulled out a thick folder. The Kandahar investigation. Complete military records. Full exoneration plus a commendation for integrity during the inquiry. He held it toward Rob. Donald's bluffing. There's nothing in your record that could hurt you. Rob took the folder, flipped through pages that transported him back 15 years to the worst 6 months of his career. Bridge collapse in Afghanistan. 2 civilian contractors dead. Accusations of miscalculation, negligence, criminal incompetence. Then the investigation that cleared him completely proved the contractor had substituted inferior steel to pocket. The difference established that Rob's engineering specifications had been perfect. The final page held a commendation signed by a 3-star general. Captain Mitchell's adherence to proper engineering protocols under extreme pressure represents the highest standards of the Corps of Engineers. His integrity during investigation proceedings is exemplary. Kenneth's voice came out hoarse. Donald can't hurt you with this. He's counting on you, not knowing that. Rob closed the folder, studied the man who'd betrayed Margaret's trust. Why help now? Because I failed her once. Kenneth removed his glasses, rubbed eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. Donald threatened my grandson, Evan. Said he'd destroy the boy's college prospects, make sure no decent school would touch him. I was weak. I gave Donald what he wanted, control over the will, reading the false document, time to prepare his attack. The old lawyer's hands trembled. But I drew a line. I gave you the safe deposit key. I knew Margaret's real instructions were in Clearwater. I knew you'd find them eventually. George spoke from his position near the workshop. Eventually isn't the same as immediately. No. Kenneth's shoulders sagged. It's not. I'm sorry. Rob wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold the betrayal close like a weapon. But he'd spent enough years in the Army to recognize genuine regret when he saw it. Kenneth had been cornered, made bad choices, and was trying to make them right. That counted for something. What else did Donald threaten you with? Kenneth pulled out more papers. This is what he's really afraid of. Bank statements, transfer records, investment documents. Donald's been embezzling from the family trusts for 8 years, small amounts at first, then larger. Margaret discovered it 2 years ago, started documenting everything. If the estate goes to legal challenge, all these records become evidence. Donald doesn't just lose the inheritance fight, he goes to prison for fraud. The pieces clicked together. Donald hadn't just wanted Margaret's land for profit. He'd needed to control the estate, to bury evidence of his crimes. Margaret, leaving everything to Rob, had put the entire scheme at risk. Rob looked at the documents that could destroy Donald. Kensington felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Margaret knew about the embezzlement before she died. She confronted him 6 months ago, told him she was cutting him out of the will entirely. Kenneth's voice dropped to barely audible. Her stress levels went through the ceiling after that. Blood pressure medication stopped working. The doctors said... He didn't finish, didn't need to. Margaret had died of heart failure, accelerated by stress. Donald had effectively killed his own sister by pushing her into a corner, forcing her to spend her final months fortifying defenses instead of enjoying life. Kit's small voice carried from the porch. "Mr. Kenneth, are you here to help my dad?" The old lawyer looked at the boy, expression crumbling. "Yes, son. That's exactly why I'm here." Rob made a decision. "Come inside. You need to see what Margaret left." They spent 2 hours in the cabin, Kenneth reading through Margaret's journal, studying the real will, examining property documents. The lawyer's professional mask cracked completely when he reached Margaret's final journal entry, the one where she apologized for putting him in an impossible position, thanked him for at least giving Rob the tools to find the truth. "She forgave me." Kenneth's voice broke. "Even knowing I'd betray her." George made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and they planned. Donald's 3-day ultimatum expired tomorrow. He'd expect Rob to either accept the buyout or brace for character assassination. Instead, Rob would go on offense. Kenneth pulled out his phone, fingers moving with newfound purpose. "I'm calling a town meeting tomorrow night. Community center. If Donald wants a fight, let's give him one in front of witnesses." That afternoon, a rusted pickup truck pulled into the clearing. The driver who emerged looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts, and bad decisions, early 30s military haircut growing out unevenly, hands that shook slightly until he shoved them in his jacket pockets. Dark eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much and slept too little. Ranger approached cautiously, sniffed the air, then his tail moved once. Recognition not of the man, but of the type. Combat veteran, fellow survivor. The man stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. "George Hartwell sent me. Said you might need help with the workshop." His voice carried the flattened affect of someone working very hard to stay level. "I'm Brian Callahan, Marine Corps. Discharged 3 years ago." Rob recognized the signs immediately. PTSD, wearing through whatever medication or therapy was supposed to keep it contained, the slight tremor, the hypervigilance scanning the tree line, the way Brian positioned himself with clear sight lines to all approaches. Army, 20 years, combat engineer. Rob gestured toward the workshop. You know boats. Grew up building them with my dad. Before, Brian's jaw clenched. Before Iraq. George emerged from the workshop, gave Brian a nod that held complicated history. Brian's good with his hands, just needs a reason to use them. The younger man's face tightened. I'm 90 days sober. If I fall off, George will know immediately, and I'm gone. No second chances. Rob understood what wasn't being said. Brian had a daughter somewhere lost custody because of drinking, was fighting his way back toward being someone his child could be proud of. The workshop could be part of that fight, or another place to fail. When can you start? Brian's shoulders dropped half an inch, tension releasing slightly. Right now, if you'll have me. They worked until dark, Rob and George teaching Brian the basics of the hull. They were repairing, falling into the rhythm men found when working with wood and tools and shared purpose. Kit and Rachel played nearby ranger supervising, and for a few hours the world felt simple enough to navigate. The town meeting packed Clearwater Ridge's community center beyond capacity. Folding chairs filled every available space. People standing along the walls pressed into doorways, craning to see the front where a folding table served as makeshift podium. Rob estimated 200 people, maybe more, nearly a quarter of the town's population. Donald stood near the front, Mark Donovan beside him. The developer wore a suit that cost more than most people in this room, made in a month, smile practiced and empty. They'd brought presentation equipment, laptop projector screen showing aerial photos of Clearwater Ridge with computer-generated overlays of proposed development, resort, condominiums, marina expansion, ski lodge, all the words that meant progress to some people and destruction to others. Trish occupied a chair in the second row, phone in hand, pretending disinterest while clearly documenting everything. Stephen sat beside her, face unreadable. Rob stood at the back with Kit pressed against his side, George on his other flank, Brian and Kenneth nearby. Ranger lay at Kit's feet, calm but alert. Amanda Fletcher, the town clerk, called the meeting to order. Explained that Cascade Development had requested community input on a proposed project requiring significant land acquisition. She gestured to Mark Donovan, who stood with practiced ease. Thank you all for coming. What we're proposing will transform Clearwater Ridge into a destination. Jobs for your children, tax revenue for schools and infrastructure, economic growth that will benefit every family here. Mark clicked through slides showing happy people skiing, boating, dining at outdoor cafes that didn't exist. The centerpiece is the riverfront property currently owned by Robert Mitchell. We've made generous offers, but Mr. Mitchell has refused. We're here tonight to ask the community, should one man's stubbornness block progress for everyone? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Donald stood, added his voice to the pitch. My sister Margaret loved Clearwater Ridge, but she also understood economic reality. This town is dying. Young people leave because there's no opportunity. Businesses close. Properties sit vacant. He gestured around the room. Development means survival. Mr. Mitchell's refusal means slow death. George stood before Rob could. The old boat builder's voice carried decades of credibility. Dying. My hardware store's been here 40 years, doing just fine. Carol's Bakery, 50 years. This town isn't dying, it's choosing not to become something else. A woman near the front stood mid-30s professional bearing red hair pulled back efficiently. I'm Laura Whitfield, wildlife biologist with the EPA. Mr. Mitchell's property contains 3 active osprey nests. These birds are protected under federal law. Any development would require environmental impact studies taking years, possibly decades. The ospreys were here first. They're not leaving for condos. Donald's smile tightened. Miss Whitfield, I'm sure accommodations can be made. No. Laura's voice cut like a scalpel. They can't. The nesting sites are irreplaceable. Development is legally impossible without destroying protected habitat, which triggers automatic federal injunctions. Mark Donovan's professional polish cracked slightly. This wasn't in his presentation. Another person stood, younger woman, maybe 24, teacher's posture and gentle voice that somehow carried authority. I'm Melissa Cooper. I teach at Clearwater Elementary. When I was 10, my parents died. Foster care couldn't pay for anything beyond basics. Someone in this town paid my entire education elementary through college, every semester. Anonymous donations that changed my life. She looked directly at Rob. I found out last week it was Margaret Kensington. She helped 12 kids total, $250,000 over 15 years. Never asked for recognition, never expected gratitude, just quiet kindness, because she believed in this community. The room went absolutely silent. Melissa's eyes moved to Donald. Your sister believed in Clearwater Ridge exactly as it is, not as a resort, not as a development opportunity, as home. She sat down, and the silence held another beat before people started talking, whispering, reassessing. Kenneth Warner stood briefcase open. I have documents here that might interest this community. Financial records showing Donald Kensington embezzled $1.8 million from family trusts over 8 years. Margaret discovered this, confronted him, cut him from her will. His development scheme isn't about progress, it's about accessing money to cover his crimes. Donald's face went white, then red. That's privileged information. You can't. It became unprivileged when you threatened my grandson to force my cooperation. Kenneth's voice stayed level, lawyer steady. Every document here is legally obtained, properly authenticated, and admissible in court. The meeting dissolved into chaos. People shouting questions, Donald shouting denials, Mark Donovan gathering his equipment and heading for the exit like the building was on fire. Trish stood frozen, phone forgotten, staring at her uncle with an expression that might have been shock or might have been relief that someone finally said it out loud. Stephen pushed through the crowd toward Rob, face pale. I didn't know about the embezzlement, about any of it. His voice barely carried over the noise. Mom tried to tell me something was wrong. I didn't listen. Rob studied Margaret's son, saw genuine horror there. You listening now? Yeah. Stephen pulled something from his pocket, a small USB drive. This is everything. Mom's emails, her investigation notes, recordings of phone calls with Donald. She sent them to me 6 months ago. I never looked. Thought it was just family drama. His hand shook. I'm sorry. For all of it. The drive felt heavy in Rob's palm. Evidence, proof, ammunition. Before Rob could respond, Amanda Fletcher called for order, threatened to clear the room if people didn't settle. It took 10 minutes, but eventually the crowd quieted enough for her to speak. This meeting is about community input on development. I'm calling an informal vote. All in favor of Cascade Development's proposal, raise your hands. Maybe 30 hands went up, less than 15%. All opposed. The rest of the room, 170 people, give or take, raised their hands in united front. Donald stood slowly, face rigid with controlled fury. "This isn't over, Mitchell. Not by a long shot." He left Trish, following Stephen, hesitating before walking out alone through a different exit. Mark Donovan was already gone, probably calling corporate headquarters to explain how a guaranteed deal had imploded spectacularly. People surrounded Rob afterward, shaking hands, offering support, sharing stories about Margaret's quiet generosity. Carol appeared with cookies because apparently that's what Carol did. Pastor Timothy Bradford invited Rob to church, not pushy, just open. Laura Whitfield gave him her card, suggested they discuss conservation easements that would protect the osprey habitat permanently. Kit stood close throughout, overwhelmed by the attention, but also something else. Belonging, maybe. The sense that these people were choosing him and his father, defending them without being asked. Rachel found Kit in the crowd, grabbed his hand. "My grandpa says your dad's a hero." Kit looked up at Rob with eyes that held complicated emotions. Grief for Margaret, gratitude for protection, and something new, pride. They walked home through December darkness, Ranger ranging ahead, breathmaking white clouds. Kit's hand stayed in Rob's, and for the first time since the funeral, the boy's grip felt secure instead of desperate. "Dad, are we staying? Really staying?" Rob squeezed gently. "Really staying, buddy. 3 years minimum, probably longer." "Good." Kit's voice carried absolute certainty. "I like it here." 2 days later, Rob was working in the workshop with Brian and George when Ranger erupted into full alert mode. Not the warning bark from when Donald arrived, attack bark, threat bark, the sound military working dogs made when something was actively wrong. Rob dropped his tools, ran for the cabin. Kit and Rachel had been inside doing homework, supervised by Carol, who'd stopped by with soup. Safe, protected, except the cabin door stood open. Carol's station wagon sat in the clearing driver's door, hanging wide. Rob's combat training kicked in immediately. Assess, locate, respond. He hit the porch at a dead run, cleared the doorframe low and fast, saw the main room empty. Furniture disturbed. Carol's soup pot spilled across the floor. "Kit." His voice echoed through empty space. Ranger shot past him, nose to the ground, tracking. The dog moved with absolute certainty toward the back door, which also stood open. Snow trampled by multiple sets of footprints. Adult feet. Heavy. 2 sets, maybe 3. George and Brian caught up, both breathing hard. George's face went gray when he saw the open doors. "Rachel!" Brian was already on his phone calling the sheriff. Rob followed Ranger outside, reading the tracks with skills learned, tracking insurgents in Afghan mountains. 2 adults, both male, based on boot size. They'd grabbed the kids quickly, carried them. No kid-sized footprints meant the children hadn't been walking, headed toward the access road. Ranger tracked relentlessly, powerful body moving through snow, following a scent trail only he could detect. Rob stayed on his heels, George and Brian close behind. The trail led toward the old lumber mill, half a mile downstream, abandoned since the '80s building slowly collapsing under decades of weather and neglect. Through the trees, Rob caught movement. A white van, nondescript, parked behind the mill's loading dock. Sound carried in cold air, children crying muffled but distinct. Rob's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where a sidearm would have rested in another life. Nothing there, just civilian father facing people who'd taken his son. Brian materialized beside him, breathing controlled, eyes sharp. Combat mode engaged. Two men. Van suggests planning. They're not improvising. George pulled out his phone, texted someone. Sheriff Gary Kendrick, Army buddy of mine from Vietnam. He's 5 minutes out. 5 minutes. Lifetimes could change in 5 minutes. Ranger didn't wait for human decision-making. The dog moved silent and fast toward the loading dock. Rob followed, because stopping wasn't an option, Brian flanking George, moving to cut off retreat. Inside the mill, two men stood near a back room. Early 30s jeans and work jackets, nothing distinctive. Hired muscle, not masterminds. One held a phone, talking in low, urgent tones. Boss, the kids won't stop crying. When are you? He didn't finish because Ranger hit him like a guided missile. 80 pounds of trained military working dog moving at full speed teeth, finding the arm, holding the phone, dragging the man down with precision that spoke to thousands of hours of practice. The second man reached for something, weapon maybe, but Brian was faster. Former Marine crossed the distance in 3 strides, landed a punch that dropped the man instantly. Rob burst into the back room. Kit and Rachel huddled in the corner, hands bound with zip ties, duct tape across their mouths. Carol sat against the wall, same restraints, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Kit's eyes went huge when he saw his father. Muffled sounds of relief and terror mixed together. Rob had the zip ties cut within seconds, pulled the tape free as gently as urgency allowed. Kit threw himself into Rob's arms, sobbing, while George freed Rachel and Carol. Sheriff Gary Kendrick arrived with 2 deputies, found the scene already secured. The 2 hired men sat on the ground with Brian's knee in their backs. Ranger standing guard with the kind of calm menace that suggested moving would be extremely unwise. Gary, mid-50s, gray crew-cut face, that had seen too much, surveyed the situation with professional efficiency. Someone want to explain what happened here. The man Ranger had taken down, nursing a badly bruised arm, started talking before his partner could stop him. We were hired. $5,000 to grab the kids, scare the father into leaving town. Donald Kensington hired us, gave us photos, schedules, access routes. We didn't know, we thought it was a custody thing. Not. His partner groaned. Shut up, you idiot. Gary cuffed them both, read Miranda rights with the practiced cadence of someone who'd done this too many times. One deputy called for backup. The other documented the scene with methodical photographs. Rob held Kit close, felt the boy's heartbeat gradually slow from panicked racing to something approaching normal. Rachel clung to George, face buried in her grandfather's shoulder. Carol sat in the van with a paramedic, checking her head wound, accepting ice with shaking hands. Gary approached once the prisoners were secured in separate vehicles. Rob, hell of a homecoming to Clearwater. You know each other? George's voice held surprise. Served together. Different units, same base in Iraq. Lost touch after discharge. Gary's expression mixed professional detachment with personal concern. These idiots just confessed to conspiracy to kidnap. Donald Kensington's name is on record now. I'll need formal statements from everyone, but the case is solid. Brian materialized beside them, knuckles split and bleeding slightly. Sir, the one I hit, he had this in his pocket. He held up a folded paper. Gary unfolded it carefully. Instructions typed, specific grab, both children. Scare them. Make sure Mitchell understands refusing the buyout has consequences. Do not harm seriously, but make impact clear. Signed at the bottom, DK. Gary's jaw clenched. I'll be arresting Donald Kensington tonight. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, child endangerment, attempted extortion. Federal prosecutors will probably want this too. He looked at Rob. You okay pressing charges? Rob thought about Kit's tears, Rachel's terror, Carol's blood. Absolutely. They spent 3 hours at the sheriff's office giving statements. Kit sat in Rob's lap the entire time, refusing to let go. Rachel did the same with George. By the time they finished, word had spread through Clearwater Ridge like wildfire. Donald Kensington was arrested at his hotel in town, Trish present, watching her uncle being read his rights with an expression Rob couldn't quite decode. Not shock. Something else. Relief, maybe. Like she'd been waiting for this moment longer than anyone knew. The arrest made regional news by morning. Former businessman charged with embezzlement, kidnapping conspiracy, attempted extortion. Federal prosecutors announced they'd be filing additional charges related to the financial crimes. Donald's lawyer issued a statement denying everything but the recorded confession from the hired men made denial academic. Trish and Stephen appeared at the cabin 2 days later without Donald, without lawyers. Just Margaret's children looking smaller somehow without their uncle's influence. Stephen spoke first, words coming hard. We're dropping any claim to the Clearwater property. Mom wanted you to have it. That's clear now. He handed Rob a folder. These are quitclaim deeds signed by both of us. Legal transfer of any theoretical interest we might have had. Your lawyer can review them. Trish stood silent face, unreadable. Finally, she spoke, voice stripped of the condescension Rob remembered from the funeral. She loved you. Mom really loved you. Her throat worked. I thought you were taking advantage of her, using her money, her status. I was wrong. Rob waited, Kit pressed against his side, Ranger alert nearby. I found letters. Trish's hands twisted together. Mom's letters to you. Donald had intercepted them, kept them as leverage. 40 letters she wrote during her illness, telling you how much she loved you, how Kit was the best thing that happened to her, how she was proud of the man you were. Her voice cracked. You never got to read them while she was alive. Donald made sure of that. She pulled a wooden box from her bag, held it toward Rob. These are yours. Should have been yours all along. Rob took the box with trembling hands. Kit leaned closer, curious. Inside, 40 envelopes, Margaret's handwriting across each one, dates spanning the last year of her life. Stephen cleared his throat. There's one more thing. Mom set up a foundation, $2 million, for children of veteran scholarships, counseling support services. The board of directors includes you, Carol, Pastor Timothy, Melissa Cooper, and Kit when he turns 25. He managed a small smile. She planned everything, even us finally figuring out we were wrong about you. After they left, Rob sat at the kitchen table, opening letters, one by one, reading Margaret's words, learning about the woman he'd married through prose she'd never been able to speak aloud. Kit read over his shoulder, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling. One letter dated 3 weeks before her death. Rob, I'm running out of time. The doctors won't say it directly, but I can read their faces. My heart is giving up, and I'm not strong enough to fight what's coming. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving you and Kit alone to face my family's cruelty. But I've done everything I can to protect you both. The real will, the land, the foundation, all the pieces are in place. Kit asked me yesterday if I'd be his mom forever. I told him, yes, even when I'm not here physically, I'll always be his mom in his heart. He said, that's good enough. Teach him to build things, my love. You're so good at that. Building bridges, building trust, building lives from broken pieces. Build him a childhood at Clearwater Ridge that makes all this pain worth surviving. I love you. I love Kit. I love the life we had, brief as it was. Don't mourn me too long. Go north, find the cabin, trust the dog, and build something beautiful. Forever yours, Margaret. Rob folded the letter carefully, added it back to the stack. Kit leaned against him, silent. She really did love us, Dad. Yeah, buddy, she really did. Spring came slowly to Montana, snow reluctating, retreating under lengthening days and tentative warmth. The workshop transformation accelerated. Brian proved George's faith, justified, skilled hands, creative problem-solving, showing up sober every single morning. By April, they'd completed their first boat together, a 16-foot cedar canoe that launched on Clearwater River, to cheers from half the town. Brian's ex-wife Amanda brought their daughter Lily for supervised visits that gradually extended. 6 years old, shy, beautiful. She and Kit became immediate friends, and Rachel rounded out a trio that explored the riverbanks with Ranger, shadowing them like a furry guardian angel. Laura Whitfield worked with Rob to establish permanent conservation easements protecting the osprey nests and 200 acres of old-growth forest. The legal protections made future development impossible, guaranteed habitat preservation, and qualified the property for substantial tax benefits that would fund ongoing conservation work. Melissa Cooper organized the first Margaret Kensington Scholarship Award ceremony. 5 local kids received college funding, emotional speeches, grateful families. The foundation's board met quarterly, Rob learning nonprofit management from people who'd been doing this work for decades. The town changed too slowly but noticeably. New businesses opened a coffee shop run by a young couple from Seattle who wanted small-town life, a bookstore specializing in Montana history, an outfitter company offering wilderness tours that emphasized conservation over conquest, not explosive growth, careful growth, sustainable growth. 3 years passed faster than Rob expected. Kit turned 10 tall for his age, now confident in ways the frightened 7-year-old at Margaret's funeral never could have imagined. Rachel remained his best friend, Lily, part of their constant trio. Brian married a local teacher, regained full custody of Lily, built a life that looked nothing like the wreckage he'd been when he first arrived at the workshop. On the exact anniversary of Margaret's death, Rob stood on the cabin porch watching sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. Ranger lay beside him, grayer now, moving slower, but still alert, still protective. Kit appeared in the doorway, sleepy but determined. "Morning, Dad. Morning, buddy." They stood together in silence, remembering. Then Kit pulled something from his pocket, a drawing he'd made, Margaret and Sarah, floating among clouds, both smiling down at a cabin by a river where a man and a boy and a dog built boats. "Think they can see us? Both moms?" Rob's throat closed around emotion that never quite went away. "I think they can. And I think they're proud of who you're becoming." "Who we're becoming," Kit corrected. "You changed too." That was true. 3 years ago, Rob had been a man erased from someone else's will, driving north, with nothing but grief and a key to a mystery. Now he was part of a community leader of a foundation, father to a boy who laughed easily and loved freely, friend to people who measured worth by character instead of bank accounts. The 3-year requirement had passed. The property was legally, uncontestably his. He could sell it tomorrow, take the millions, move anywhere. But the thought felt absurd now. This was home. Not because Margaret's will required it, but because he'd built something here that mattered more than money. The workshop hummed with activity 6 days a week now. 15 veterans enrolled in training programs, boat building, carpentry, wilderness, guiding. 30 kids participated in summer camps, teaching traditional crafts, environmental stewardship, river ecology. The town's population had stabilized, then started growing slowly, with young families seeking exactly what Clearwater Ridge offered: community purpose connection. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong, Rob had learned. It's between what's easy and what's worth fighting for. Margaret had known that. She'd fought for this place, for him, for Kit, using every tool she had, money, planning, a brilliant dog, and faith that Rob would understand eventually what she'd been building. He understood now. Kit tugged his sleeve. Dad, Carol's making pancakes at the big breakfast. We should go. The big breakfast was a community tradition now, first Sunday of every month, rotating between locations. This month, the new community hall, built partially with foundation funds, partially with volunteer labor, completely with the kind of collective effort that made places like Clearwater Ridge survive when logic said they shouldn't. They walked to town through morning that smelled like pine and Possibility Ranger between them, moving slower but still keeping pace. Half the town was already there when they arrived: George and Rachel Bryan and Amanda and Lily Carroll and her sister Amanda Fletcher, Pastor Timothy and his wife Laura Whitfield with her new husband Melissa Cooper, with her students, veterans from the training program, kids from summer camp, faces Rob recognized, and names he knew. Kenneth Warner appeared at Rob's elbow, considerably healthier than 3 years ago. Evan, his grandson, was enrolled at University of Montana, now studying environmental law, came home every break to work with Laura on conservation projects. She'd be proud of this. Kenneth gestured around the crowded hall. All of it. What you've built. Rob watched Kit, laughing, with Rachel and Lily, watched Brian teaching a young veteran how to properly sharpen a chisel, watched the community that had formed around the foundation Margaret laid. We built it, all of us. She knew you would, Kenneth smiled. That's why she chose you. The breakfast dissolved into conversation. Laughter, plans for summer programs, discussion of the new boat order from a lodge up north. Normal life, complicated and beautiful, and exactly what Margaret had envisioned when she'd plotted her complicated inheritance scheme. Later, walking back to the cabin, Kit asked the question Rob had been waiting for. Dad, when I'm 25 and join the foundation board, think I'll be ready. Rob looked at his son, who'd lost 2 mothers and found strength anyway, who'd been told he didn't belong and built belonging through sheer force of character, who'd learned that family wasn't about blood, but about who showed up when it mattered. You're already ready, buddy. The next 15 years are just practice. Kit grinned, raced ahead to where Ranger waited, and together they disappeared into the trees toward the river, where beaver dams needed inspecting, and adventures waited around every bend. Rob followed more slowly, in no particular hurry, because hurrying meant missing the details. The way morning light caught on water, the sound of his son's laughter echoing through forest, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. Margaret had built him a bridge from grief to purpose. He'd crossed it, bringing Kit with him, and found on the other side not just inheritance, but legacy. Not just property, but home. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as loss, wrapped in confusion, requiring faith to unwrap. Rob had learned that lesson the hard way. Now he taught it to veterans rebuilding shattered lives, to kids learning that worth came from contribution instead of consumption, to a community that chose preservation over profit. The cabin appeared through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left the fire banked. 3 years since he'd arrived with nothing but questions and a dog who knew more than he did. 3 years of building, growing, healing, becoming. Rob stood on the porch one more time, looked out at land he'd protect for the rest of his life, and whispered to the woman who'd made all this possible. "Thank you, Margaret, for seeing who I could be before I knew myself." The wind through the pines sounded almost like an answer, almost like approval, almost like love that transcended death and distance and became something permanent, woven into the very fabric of the place she'd chosen to save. Ranger's single deliberate footfall on the wooden porch echoed like punctuation, like affirmation, like the last piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Home.